I'm Ashton Addison from Rchain for Investmentpitch Media and FinTech News Network. And today on Blockchain Interviews, we have Professor Steve Ross-Talbot, board member of the Rchain Project and Co-op. Steve, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Ashton.
Yeah, likewise.
I've seen a few of your broadcasts. I've always enjoyed them.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, for this interview, I'd love to dive into the Rchain Co-op. And if we could just kick it off, for those who aren't familiar yet, from your words, what is the Rchain project all about, and how is it changing the space?
Okay, so Rchain is an open source advanced blockchain project, and it's run by Rchain, which is in itself a cooperative. And that becomes quite important. Its aspirations are to have a scalable, globally secure, trusted and safe blockchain that can operate right across the globe, achieving transaction rates that hitherto have not been seen in public blockchains. Mm-hmm. And it does that really by dint of the underlying mathematics on the one side, from which it derives, which is what we call the pi calculus, from which the row calculus is derived. Mm-hmm. And people might say, well, why is that important? Well, if we start to scale public blockchains, in a trustless world, we need consensus protocols to keep us truthful. Mm-hmm. And it's clear from the use of Facebook that truth is in rather short supply, and yet many will act upon it, whether they buy things because of it, whether they vote because of it. But trust certainly is in short supply, and it's odd to reflect. When you reflect back to radio, when we had radio only, I mean, this is before I was born really, but when we had radio, we were never really connected as communities. Mm-hmm. That sense of what was going on from the East Coast to the West Coast of America, you would only get through the radio, and you really didn't understand the West Coast if you were on the East Coast. You'd never been there. Mm-hmm. So communication has a habit of really creating empathy between and binding communities together that can be quite disparate. And oddly enough, with the advent of live TV, not just ordinary TV, but live TV, my God, this was a massive impact on American society alone. Mm-hmm. So if you go back to the civil rights movement in the USA in the 1960s, it really got traction on live TV when Ruby Bridges went to that desegregated school. Mm-hmm. And it was broadcast live on TV. And this typifies what happens when we communicate and we trust in that communication, because we trusted the TV, we trusted the broadcasters, but there's always this notion of trusting some third party. And mm-hmm. when we get that trust, change happens. The civil rights movement, things did change. Mm-hmm. They continue to change. And now in the world we live in today, in the social media world, centralization has shifted from the TV broadcasters towards social media platforms. So mm-hmm. we see Zuckerberg being interviewed by Congress and things like this. And those platform providers provide much of the information that many people act on today, whether they're buying, voting, whatever. Now, the advent of mobile phones had a major uptick this year because we saw George Ford die. Mm-hmm. And Black Lives Matter was founded before that, but as a result of that, the closeness of that communication and the timeliness of it, we see common cause and people getting on the streets and demonstrating and doing all these things. And yet, we question social media platform giants like Facebook, feeling that there's not much trust in them. And yet we continue as a society largely mm-hmm. To trust in our own ability to determine the truth, which perhaps is not a wise thing in these transformative social media days. What's clear is centralization's had its day. The rise of blockchain is here, mm-hmm. and it will, and that will continue to carry on. But we need to figure out what we need to trust and how we bind that trust in a digital age. So mm-hmm. assets on a blockchain don't have to be just entries of what I spent. They can be large blog articles or small tweets. They could be a piece of music, a music video. They could be many things. If only blockchains could scale, which of course up to very recent days, they have not been able to deal with that sort of scale. And the only way they've been able to deal with it, and many of the large corporates do this, is they turn the trustless dial up to, but I trust one. And if you trust one, you can scale. That's easy. We all know that. But that is really against Satoshi's vision of having trust that's algorithmically derived. Now, if you imagine Bitcoin and Ethereum having provided that scale, if only they could have done that. I mean, they couldn't technically, but wonderful it may sound. But actually what would have happened was we would have seen a load of DAO bugs, far more than we saw today, because the smart contracting language are not safe. And if you go and put a smart contracting language out there on the chain, and it's not safe, and another smart contracting language interacts with it, another instance of one interacts with it, you don't really know what the consequences may be. And we need to know that at the point that we deploy a smart contract, not after we deploy when we find a DAO bug, yet another DAO bug.
Yeah.
So the other thing that's really quite key to Rchain is the theoretical foundations of it. It's no accident that Greg, and I don't think I've told this publicly, but I will tell it. I think it must have been 4 or 5 years ago, when before Rchain was created at all, and Greg was over in London. He was at an Ethereum conference, and I met up with him because I've known him for years, and we started talking about theory and this blockchain stuff, and we both are lovers of describing protocols theoretically and swapping ideas on that. And I said, somebody should really do a treatment of Ethereum and smart contracts, because I'm really worried that people are going to deploy these things and they've got no idea what they're going to do, and they're immutable. Oh my God, this will be a real problem. We'll have to have the most elaborate patterns off the chain to prevent us from going to a smart contract that is causing problems. We won't be able to just decommission it. It's there forever. Somebody should deal with this, Greg. And Greg looked at me and he said, look at this. Scribbled some stuff on a sheet of paper, as is often the way that he does things, and said, what do you think? He said, I can derive any type system from any type system. And he went into Gregland and came out and said, actually, I'm working on this, Steve. And so it's not a surprise that Rchain is the way it is. And it's been done to deal with how do we provide trust in a trustless world at internet scale for all sorts of applications, whatever they may be. And there's a plethora of them that we can perhaps talk about as we go.
Yeah, well, that's a great intro, Steve. And you touched on a lot of great points there. You touched on the mathematics, the scalability, which I want to dive into as well, the trust, and the decentralization or the co-op. I guess if we can pinpoint each of those pieces, one of the outputs of Rchain's functionality right now is that it has that high scalability. How important did you see this scalability piece out of all of those other pieces that you touched on as a part of the value that Rchain delivers and needs to continue to grow?
I think it's the key differentiator. I mean, if you don't scale and you deploy smart contracts and you don't bother about behavioral typing, actually the behavioral typing is less relevant, because just the number of transactions through it that might cause a problem are much less. So it's the old 80-20 rule in software. But as you scale, that 80-20 changes in terms of its focus. As you scale, the more transactions you have, the more opportunities there are for exchanges of messages between smart contracts. And the more opportunity there is for live locks, deadlocks, and other unintended consequences. The typical consequences that cost enterprises a fortune to find. They're the hardest bugs to find usually. So getting that right from the behavioral typing side is a requirement if you scale, because it gives you protection as you scale. It gives you safeness as you scale. So imagine imagine the next election in the USA, coming up in November, being on a blockchain 220 million, I don't know exactly what the electoral roll is, but it must be a very large number. And they all go to the poll on the same day. Well, a traditional blockchain right now, or even an elevated one like Ethereum, could not deal with that. You need to be able to deal with that in real time. So you really do need to be able to scale to ensure that within, say, a 24-hour period, every single person in the United States could hit the same blockchain. Otherwise, you can't have immutable records of voting. You couldn't have immutable discourses where people discuss things like they do on Facebook and Twitter, but there's no opportunity if somebody's done something to undo it, and therefore you have a provenance. That actually makes you more careful about what you put down there. And of course, if you have things like that, then you can treat all of that information in a social media world as data that may have value to others, and provide a smart contract around it to monetize it, so that we're in charge of our own data. It's part of the value that we bring to society. But you can't do societal level transformations if you only do 100 transactions a second.
Yeah.
So you need the scale, and you need the trust and safety.
Yeah.
Because I would hate it that we launched anything and it turns out that somebody's vote got missed. We're actually launching a voting app and a deliberation app for the AGM. So we will be using our own voting and our own deliberation app to fuel our own AGM in October. And then we'll be offering that to other communities that want to use it. And of course, because we can scale it internet scale, it really does offer the possibility of having a very secure voting mechanism.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and it's great application. And I wanted to touch on a little bit on the trust part. You mentioned scalability and trust, and you can scale if there's only one person that you need to trust, and they're doing all the work, but that's really not decentralized and democratized. But with the Rchain Co-op, it's one of the only projects that's grown that is a cooperative and has a different, more democratic structure to it. Can you talk about your experience? You're a board member of the co-op. How has the co-op structure, changed the way that the project is growing as opposed to these other traditional blockchain projects?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at who's involved in Rchain, Greg certainly, but there's several other people involved in the community. Jim Whitescarver, Dan Connolly, myself, several others. We all came from W3C. W3C, whilst there is almost a sense of a benign dictatorship with Tim doesn't have the power over everything. He ceded the power. This is the guy that gave up the patent. This is the guy that fought with IBM and Microsoft back in the day. And I think we were all impacted by Tim's real belief in humanity and the innate good in humanity. And that's the same innate good that powers our innate understanding of democracy. Give the people what they want. Just because I don't get what I want in a vote doesn't mean that I wouldn't support it. I would. But I want that voting to be, I want that democracy to be participatory, or at least have the possibility of it. And so Rchain itself as a cooperative needs to be participatory as well. And it's not always getting members, it's not always easy getting members to participate, but we did an ideation workshop recently, and that was pretty good. A lot of members participated in that. So one way that we tried to get that participation up and current and moving is through things like ideation workshops. We're going to do a hackathon soon as well. That's one that's coming up soon. But also just changing some of the governance structures of the co-op, ensuring that everything is transparent. I remember talking to Miko Matsunori, who was on the choreography working group with me when I first met Greg. And he's quite big, as you know, in the sort of crypto world. And I said, what's the perception of Rchain? This was probably about a year ago. And he said, great technology, Steve, but there may be some problems with off-chain governance. I think that was the phrase he used. And I knew exactly what he meant, because there'd been much in the press. And it's a bit like W3C. W3C, all the transcripts of every meeting are public by definition. When you do that, you're airing your dirty laundry. And Rchain definitely has had its fair share of dirty laundry airing. But that's very painful. And when I joined, it was because I trusted in the technology. I trusted in the people involved, knowing that Dan was there, knowing that Jim was there, not just Greg, but knowing those guys were there. That was quite a big thing, because I know how they work, because of all my W3C experience before, where you drive to a consensus. You try never ever to have a vote on anything. You try to just do it through consensus, which is very time consuming. You have to be very patient, but you have to always have in the forefront of your mind that, in a sense, as an elected director, you are there to represent the interests of the members. You're not there to represent your own interests. Those actually have to come secondary to anything that you do. You have to go out, and that means you've got to talk to people. So setting up the various committees, the working groups, being on, my life is spent on Zoom, which was very handy because I was highly experienced when lockdown came to the UK and Zoom took off here. But it's a painful transition. I spoke to Roger Hallam, who was the guy behind Extinction Rebellion. He was from Somerset, west of England. So you may have heard of Extinction Rebellion. They're a global organisation now. They started off as a little pod of about 6 people in Somerset, in England, in little sort of sleepy place. But they enshrined at the very beginning the ethos of decentralised decision making. And so they went from centralised with a lot of pain to decentralised. But what they did was follow that core principle. And that's kind of what we're doing in the co-op today, even. We're getting better at it. We get picked up. It's a hard process because there's a lot of entrenched behaviours in meetings. But I think it's definitely taking root, that's for sure. And there's a lot more smiling faces, and I would say more active participation than there was probably 6 months, 7 months ago when we were probably at our lowest. And now it's on the uptick, and it's on the uptick definitely in part because of the way that the co-op itself is run and is held accountable. So that's really good because we end up now having a strong set of board members, and who challenge Greg. I mean, Greg's often referred to as the god of Rchain, and yes, he is. He is the founder, the spirit of it in many respects. But that spirit isn't his alone; it's shared, and that's why many of us joined. And I think now we can represent Rchain every bit as well as Greg. It's just Greg will always have. He was the guy that kind of came up with this in the beginning and pulled everyone together. So he always has that very elevated position. But it's no longer what many people were concerned about. And this is the dirty laundry, that it's the Greg show. It never was, in truth. In fact, the decentralization core of Rchain was down to a motion in the board that Greg brought to the board that actually would do him out of his own position. So Greg was always embracing that notion of decentralization, believing that you can't have this global computer, this platform of this magnitude that could do all of these things. You couldn't have it owned by an individual or a company in the conventional sense. It had to be with a lot of members who then attenuate what it can do. So it's a truly, it's nice because it's kind of like decentralized on the inside, decentralized on the outside. And it's not to say that centralization is bad. It's just that centralization's got us a long way at the end of the day. But now's the time for decentralization to fill in the cracks that we're now discovering in this digital age. And I think Rchain's got a real shot at doing it.
That's
I
a great...
actually sent an email to Keir Starmer, who's the leader of the opposition here in the UK, explaining to him, without ever mentioning Rchain, what he needs to achieve the vision of digital democracy. So I sent that to him today. We'll see if he responds, but I have already been working with the leader of the opposition in this country, in the UK, and talking to them about the technology needs for the future.
Very cool, Steve. Well, we're running out of time here. What is the best way for viewers to learn more about Rchain or get involved with the co-op?
Well, come to rchain.coop on the web. You can join up for $20. You can go on YouTube, look for Rchain, just do a search on YouTube. Most of our calls are all published as YouTube on the Rchain channel on YouTube. Climate and coordination is a really cool one to come to. It's quite a feisty little one, but equally the community debriefs. Come to the community debriefs. That's what I'd urge people to do, because we're going to be demoing our voting app, and we're going to be demoing some other really cool apps, I think, that really will show off the potential for Rchain.
Very cool. Well, I will leave those links in the description box below for the viewers. Thank you so much for taking the time, Steve. All the best on the project moving forward, and let's follow up in the near future.
Pleasure, Ashton. Pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.